I don't think that the biggest problems facing America or the West in general are solved with more technology. Some are caused, I think, by too much technology, but you kind of go through 5 decades now of globalization. It's really been, in my mind, the largest accounting fraud in American history. I mean, we were sold that, you get cheaper televisions and cheaper products and that the costs were minimal. I mean, you'd be a fool to not understand that there's a very high correlation between the decimation of our middle class and our manufacturing capability and all the knock-on effects. I mean, we talked about fentanyl earlier. Like, that is a direct cost of globalization.
So yeah, talk about Atomic and what you and Aaron co-founded in the company.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, Aaron and I have known each other a long time. I mean, maybe it's best to kind of go back a bit before that, if that's useful, just because he and I have known each other for so long. But yeah, Aaron and I are from Cleveland, Ohio, and both grew up kind of different sides of the city, but knew each other from undergrad. He went to Kent State. I was at Case Western, and just had a similar friend group and knew each other from kind of early on in our college years. And both of us always kind of had that entrepreneurial builder bug. When I was a kid, I grew up really kind of seeing the ashes of this formerly great city, Cleveland. It was formerly the richest, depending on how you measure it, by most metrics, the richest city in the entire country. You didn't have to squint too hard to see that back then, right out the kind of post-Gilded Age era. And as for like all the cities in the Midwest and now Rust Belt. But before it was rusty, I mean, it was gilded, right? That's why it's rusty now. And I'd always been curious why the city I grew up in that still has kind of, the echoes of a formerly great past, a lot of incredible infrastructure, a highway system that's built for a population that's like 4 times the size. They've sort of the inverse problem you guys have down there in Austin, Texas. There's just zero traffic, which I guess isn't a problem, but it definitely begs the question, what happened, right? And in a similar way where we're throwing the summit, which I'd love to talk about, in Detroit, 20, 30 years after Cleveland's kind of decline started, Detroit, reached its peak as well about 100 years ago. And same thing. These are two of the poorest cities now in the entire country. Cleveland has the number 1 spot. So we're number 1 after being the number 1 richest, now the number 1 poorest, just the city itself. But there's so much wealth and an industry around Cleveland itself, like just right over the border, 2 minutes, over the border in all the suburbs. And so, I'd always wondered like what was going on with this, and did my undergrad at Case in engineering. Had built, some startups that never really got off the ground. Early version of Google AdSense was probably my biggest claim to fame. It's so small that you can't really look it up. I mean, this was like 2003, 2004. We were doing, sort of localized, customized advertising for web radio, like streaming. So this is like before YouTube existed, and the only media that existed back then was I'm forgetting what it was called, like internet radio. And so we're a little ahead of our time on that, but had that bug on building things. And so when I met Aaron, he had similar thing really early on. It was clear he was a physics major. Don't hold it against him. He wasn't an engineer. Still love him. And he and I just got along. We were always riffing on ideas. And he also had this background of coming from where I did in the Midwest. And I think that engendered in both of us a deep interest and affinity for building stuff in the world of atoms more than bits. I still have this awesome email from Aaron actually in 2011 or 2010 where he had spec'd up all these GPUs that we were going to buy and build a Bitcoin farm back into. I mean, and we both were mining Bitcoin like on our local, on our PCs, and probably lost more than we'll ever make. But I'll let him tell his story. But yeah, pretty tragically in a large hack. But we had sort of that instinct to be building stuff, and Aaron actually in 2012 also, and when we were starting Atomic, had sent me this email way before we started Atomic that was pointing at this I guess I don't want to name the company, but kind of an early precursor to this new deep tech renaissance that we're seeing. This is a company that was trying to automate a lot of processes in manufacturing. They never really got off the ground. I had just taken a very cushy gig at Marshall Wace, the hedge fund I was at, and would love to touch on that because it's an incredible place to work. But literally like 2 weeks after starting, he's like, you should quit the hedge fund and go join this new startup, which was doing this kind of precursor to what, the Atomics and Hadrians and other folks are all building towards. Definitely glad I didn't. The company fell apart in the next round. They couldn't get they had two problems. They struggled to get revenue, and the capital market really wasn't there for them, which is part of what's so exciting right now, I think, in this moment is not only are the companies that are being built and the energy and the people who want to work at them, but the boring bit is also in the right time right now. The boring bit being the capital markets. I mean, investors are actually interested in investing in these businesses that previously would have been dismissed by VCs as just high capex. And if you don't think this is something that's going to stick around, you have to answer the question, why is this happening when rates are at a 15, 20-year high? I mean, this is the worst time for this to be happening if you were doing it sort of a utilitarian basis. But I think there's a lot more going on than just a simple sort of analysis of like a value bet would lead you to decide what to spend your time on investing in.
Yeah, so talk about that's all awesome. I think it's going to set a conversation well for Reindustrialize and the energy that's growing around American manufacturing, reshoring, and reindustrialization. But before we get to the conference and where we're at today, so you started your career even before Atomic. You were in a hedge fund. So what was that time like? And then what was it like to transition from the world of hedge funds, which is markedly different in some ways from startups and certainly venture?
Yeah, look, I mean, it was very different world. I mean, the tech world, obviously was familiar with it, had a lot of friends working in it. But when I was in undergrad, I had just kind of known I didn't want the thing that was hot. I graduated 20 times. So the things that were hot were sort of ad optimization. Not to beat a dead horse, we all sort of, know the teal line on what we were promised and what we got. But it's kind of true. I mean, I just wasn't inspired back then to go apply at Google and answer how many ping pong balls can you fit in an airplane to then go work on ad optimization or sort of, cloud infrastructure optimization or whatever it was that they're hiring people for. I think part of that was I was just driven by solving bigger problems. And I'm not a tech solves all problems guy either, which doesn't make me, very popular in some circles. Cause I mean, I think you kind of touch on this with the vibe shift stuff, Santi, but like, I don't think that the biggest problems facing America or the West in general are solved with more technology. Some are caused, I think, by too much technology, but you kind of go through the poison food supply chain, water supply chain, child literacy rates, fentanyl, single motherhood. Like none of these are tech problems. None of these are going to be solved by a YC company. And for me, when I was looking at where to go work, I just was uninspired by the types of companies and the problems that they were solving that were recruiting from people who had my major in the job fairs I was going to. And so I went, the global financial crisis hit, and I went to go to Yale to extend sort of the research I've been doing in undergrad and go do a PhD in engineering. I'll be honest with you, I only applied to schools where, if you get your master's after 2 years, or so you get your master's after 2 years and they don't take it away if you leave. There's a part of me that knew I probably was never going to get the PhD, but it was the program there was really incredible. It was a great place to go work for a couple of years. But I got to tell you, like, as soon as I got there, I was spending most of my time in the entrepreneurship office, what they called it. It was just off the back of, Justin Kahn and a couple of other folks had just graduated. Justin TV had come out of there, and ultimately they founded Twitch, and a few other really interesting folks. Kevin Ryan from Alley Corp was there all the time. Had founded like MongoDB and a bunch of other companies. He'd come in and just do office hours, and really, I think within the first couple of weeks, I knew I didn't want to I didn't want to be an academic, and I wanted to work on really hard problems with people, who were scrappy and wanted to build. And again, like even Google, which was a startup, maybe 10 years before that, wasn't a startup at that time. It had sort of, to me, all the same problems and as like a company 20 years older, like an Intel. I remember like visiting my buddy who was at Google actually at the time, and he brought me to the food court, and he's like, everything's free. This is so cool. And he showed me like they had like a thing that would just like a laundromat, like all the amenities. And
Right.
it sort of, it was actually like repellent to me. I had the opposite response, which I think he found hard to understand. But like I was like, I'm about to graduate from college. Like this just feels like another dorm room, but like a massive. This just feels like undergrad 2.0. This is not interesting to me. And so look, hedge funds weren't on my radar. Like I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. Like there's not a lot of hedge funds there. I grew up working on our family farm. Didn't even know what a hedge fund was until I got to grad school. I mean, we have some legendary private equity firms in Cleveland. My pops was in real estate for a bit. So it's not like, I just grew up working out in the fields and didn't know anything about the investing world at all. But the hedge fund world, I mean, it's just like, it's a coastal phenomena, and it's just not something that even at Case Western, even the business majors there aren't getting recruited for these places. And so I didn't really know what it was, but I got hit up by a recruiter who kind of saw the skill set I had on LinkedIn and the background and kind of applied math and computer science. And he's like, hey, we're looking to recruit for this hedge fund called Marshall Wace. Another problem of these funds not having a big public presence, no matter how big their AUM is, it's really hard to Google any information about them. And he's like, they're building out, expanding their London headquarters, and they're going to build out a US office. And they're looking for kind of folks to build out that initial team. And saw your background and thought you'd be a good candidate. So I went and interviewed, and it was like, oh man, this is what I want to do. It wasn't on my radar. And again, I had before that had that bug about building companies, but this was like building a business within a business. They brought in like, in these funds, I mean, the right ones attract really interesting characters, ex special forces guys, ex entrepreneurs, I mean, you go down the list of these people, ex pro athletes, like highly competitive, low ego, people who just want to get stuff done. And in a lot of ways, it reminded me of the atmosphere that I imagined startups would have. But I was just a guy from Cleveland. I didn't have that experience like you do at Stanford or whatever, really being at startups. And so, I met the team, I met the, some of the founders, the whole thing. And, I was ready to go. So I dropped out. I mean, I dropped out of college.
Right.
It was a funny experience. It was kind of the second time I dropped out of college. I had dropped out previously for a different career, which maybe we have time to touch on it all. But the number of people who came to me, and this is something that's always stuck with me in my career, the number of folks who were in the PhD program that came to me and were like, how did you drop out? I was like, oh, you just go down to so-and-so's office and tell me. He's like, no, like how, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be in a PhD, but I don't want to, I don't want to go and pursue this, but I don't know how to tell my mom, or I don't know how to tell my, professor, or whatever the reason was. And I gotta tell you, like 5 or 6 people reached out with a similar thing when I quit. One of them dropped out and has killed it since then. He's had an amazing career. The others stuck around, and I'm sure they're doing fine, but like at least one of them now is doing something completely different, and was like, I wish I had kind of taken that advice like 5 years ago. I don't encourage people to drop out unless they want to. I mean, they came to me, but it was a really interesting thing where at the time I was scared as hell. Like, even though I had this great gig at this fancy firm that was going to pay off my student loans really, really quick, way faster than I could have imagined. I was still scared as hell to leave, especially because there was a bit of like that dead wood I needed to burn about my former self. That kind of, I was at Yale, I was in this fancy institution, And again, that lesson's always stuck with me about just like, you know, needing to like go all in on something, and realizing also that, you know, there's a lot of people who projecting what you think other folks might be thinking is a fool's errand, because it might actually be the opposite. And at the end of the day, like, it wasn't the path for me. So I quit. I did the hedge fund, and it was like a rocket ship. I mean, talk about joining at the right time. So the firm was a $15 billion firm called Marshall Wace, I mentioned, based in London, largest, you know, equity only long short in the world at the time, bigger than Citadel, bigger than a bunch of these guys. Some of those guys have other businesses though, like Man Group is much bigger, but they don't just have a hedge fund. They have a bunch of other businesses. Same with Citadel. They have a market making business, all this other stuff. Marshall Wace was equity only long short. That was it. We weren't running market making. We didn't have all this other stuff. And, you know, the culture there was incredible. And I joined at 15, and we went to 70 billion by the time I left. So, over 4xing that much money is a culture changes quickly. KKR came in and bought a huge chunk of the business as well. Paul and Ian are both brilliant. Paul is still a close friend and a close mentor to me to this day. And, they've managed to keep a lot of the culture there, but it was clear early on, and I hope this kind of gets to the heart of your question. It was clear early on that, that place, the incentive structure for promoting people within literally meant hundreds of millions of dollars per percentage that they'd give you in ownership in the business. Like, this is the same in VC. I mean, I know a lot of folks a lot of people reach out asking, younger people ask like, how do I break into VC? And, some of them are asking, should I take a job at this, $1 billion fund or this other one? And the answer is like, we have to understand, like, a lot of these funds, especially the ones, that are only like 10, 15 years old, but have $1 billion fund, like, those partners are still only in their early 40s. Like, there's no incentive for any of those people to get out of their seats. And the same at Marshall Wace. Like, there was guys only 5 years older than me sitting across from me making $15 million in a year minimum, who had kind of very similar seats to me just 6-8 years earlier. But I was never, and no one in my seat was ever going to take that one, because that person was only like 42. They're never going to leave. And also a lot has changed in hedge funds and sort of the arbs that work and the strategies and all of that. There was a lot of just dumb money to be made in the early 2000s that no one can make now. It just doesn't exist. It's been efficiency away. But again, a bigger part of this is just like, there's a million analysts and quants who want, a couple of really coveted seats. And at some of these shops, those guys are a lot older, but, again, at some of the shops, those men and women are young and are never going to leave. And if you have a $10 billion fund and you give away 1% of it to a new partner, just do the math, like how much value add that person has to bring in order to justify that. So I pretty quickly had my head on a swivel looking elsewhere. And that ultimately led to Atomic.
So how do you make that jump between cushy, you mentioned, described it as cushy, hedge fund?
So cushy.
Yeah. Yeah. Real quick, what was the work that you were doing there? You mentioned it was kind of like a business within a business, but what did the day-to-day look like?
Yeah. I mean, it's, so I joined on as a quant, like I said, which just means I'm staring at a screen, I'm reading white papers, I'm doing research, I'm, doing, hardcore code. I mean, like kernel level optimized C++ coding. So you're building out a strategy. You have an idea of, maybe it's a new order type that the New York Stock Exchange has announced, or some new structure that's changed in how the auctions work. Not to nerd out too deep, but, in public markets nowadays, the auctions are actually taking more and more precedent. And this has been going on for over a decade versus the entire rest of the trading day. So on some markets, the auction, which just occurs in the beginning of the day and the end of the day, is where over 30% of all of the trading for the entire day happens. So some people's strategies are just like, you don't don't trade in the middle of the day. And there's a number of infrastructure reasons for that. A lot of it's due to the sort of large passive index funds who mark to market to what the close price is. So they need to trade at that price because that's how they mark their books. Some of it is because of some efficiencies and arbitrages and strategies around the auction where you can get a lot, a lot of volume done at once. It also kind of becomes like this self-fulfilling prophecy where the auction is a place where you can trade a lot without affecting the price maybe that much. So then a lot of people trade there. So then a lot more, so some of it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, we're never going to be in a place where the markets just have an open close auction and no trading in between. But that type of looking for strategies and inefficiencies in the market or novelties that others haven't figured out, doing back testing on a strategy, and then going and actually writing the super efficient code that can operate with low enough latency to take advantage of the strategy. We were kind of like a front to back special forces group that did all of that. Most of these shops have like 40, 50 guys who do that. And we had 4 or 5 of us who built the entire infrastructure that handled like 5 trillion in annual turnover, all of the trades that went through the firm. Now we had a lot of brilliant folks on the IT side who did a lot of the database. I mean, some of these firms structure it where all of that's mixed together, but this wasn't a great place because we were the ones who were solely tasked with sort of where a lot of the value accrues. And so we were paid commensurately as well, and weren't mixed in with, as some of these other shops where there's a lot of different gigs rolled into one team. And that's why we were able to do it really leanly with just 5 of us. So that was cool, but I got really sick of staring at a computer screen. I got to be honest. And even though now my gig is a lot of staring at a computer screen and sending emails, I mean, it's a lot more interacting with other people.
Right.
There was I remember this, I had this realization. I was talking to my dad about it. I was kind of describing like, the way I become more successful here is just writing more and better code, which, describes a lot of people's jobs. But that realization was like, it was pretty clear for me. That's not how I wanted to drive the rest of my career. And, I was the weird guy, in the engineering department that could also look someone in the eye and have a conversation. I mean, especially at Case, there were, and I love my classmen that I graduated with, but I didn't have a lot of friends in the engineering department. Like I was always more attracted to people who were building stuff, like I mentioned. And even at the hedge fund, like I always was making a stink that I wanted to be not client facing necessarily. I didn't want to go raise money, but I wanted to have more of a hand in building a business within the firm. And so ultimately they put me on the trading desk, and I took off the coding chops and put on sort of the relationship, building chops and business building chops. And that was all about, building out relationships with all the big banks, looking for novel sources of liquidity, building, agreements where we could go and trade in places. People talk about dark pools and ATSs and all these things. So much of that gig is really relationships, going to the massive, capital allocators and managers who, have, massive retirement accounts or just huge pools of liquidity that they need to get in and out of, and finding interesting ways that you can build agreements with them where if I want to trade this, if I want to get out of this name and you want to get into this name, and at scale, like $100 million, there's no reason that both of us should be going to the New York Stock Exchange and putting in orders for 100 shares, 100 shares, 100 shares. Like we should just, find each other, do a deal there. And so it's a lot of that is really, it's funny because, the more the market's been digitized and quantized, it's a lot of the open outcry trader gig has gone the way of the dinosaurs. Like there's not a lot of, you go to the New York Stock Exchange now, and it's not like it was back in the day where everyone's yelling and screaming to get filled on an order. It's honestly, it's more of a dog and pony show for the IPO companies. The only reason that the NYSE exists, there's two reasons. One, those auctions I talked about earlier, there actually is a really weird, strange thing, and this goes into a lot of the things we're trying to do with Atomic and this broader movement that we're talking about beating these incumbents. I mean, there's no greater incumbent than the New York Stock Exchange. I mean, it's been around. I have the coin somewhere. I think since the 18 somethings. There still is a gig where on the closing auction, there's a army of like 22-year-olds from New Jersey who have been hired to, and these guys are all awesome. I mean, just sit with an iPad and wait for orders to come in on the closing auction and then hit accept. Now you could automate all of this away. This is not like a real service that they're providing, but because the New York Stock Exchange wants bodies at the closing auction, and they want something to show, lemonade when they come in and do their IPO. They want people to choose NYSE over NASDAQ to do their IPO, or over doing like a direct listing or whatever. There needs to be some pomp and circumstance. And so part of that, and there's a bunch of other reasons, it's why they have all the news agencies, all the finance news agencies also have like live studios down there. But part of it is you have this army of guys hitting close. And so literally just so there's more warm bodies on the floor doing something.
Yeah, it's not as exciting as if it's just a bunch of code, fill into transactions and
totally
empty room with servers.
So you take that and you realize so much of our economy is filled with that type of blow, by analogy, whether it's where I am in DC or even in private industry. And it's enough to make your head spin, I'll say. So that was the hedge fund. I had a blast. But the lesson learned there is like you got to really know where the value add is and if you're and where the growth potential actually is. And I just realized most of the folks who were in my group actually since I quit have also stepped aside or stepped into other roles at other places.
As you stepped out of the hedge fund, was it similar to when you off-ramped off the PhD where other folks were like, dude, why are you leaving or how are you doing it? Especially since in this case, you're actually making a lot of money and you're taking a huge risk with a startup.
Well, so that's a perfect segue. So, for me, even when I was there, I had been building this thesis around reindustrialization, and it wasn't popular internally to the extent I could get anyone to listen to me. The hedge funds aren't really in the business of there's macro funds that are big ideas. I was going to say they're not in the business of like big ideas, but you're mark to market on a minute by minute, second by second, fraction of a second basis. And so there are people who trade on longer trends. And to give credit where credit's due, Marshall Wace, like their holding periods are really, really long. Those people, the portfolio managers there are making longer term bets. But I think the reindustrialization thesis was just a step too far. And also, back then, like the biggest names in hedge funds were so Asia long only for decades. I mean, a guy that everyone knows, the founder of Bridgewater and Ray Dalio's just built a whole career on kind of long only Asia. And so, I started asking the question, kind of brings it back to where I was from in Cleveland. I'd go back there and ask myself, like, could I build a business that, flourishes in a place like this and could undo, some of the negative impact that globalization has brought on here. So maybe dive deep into a lot of those themes. And so, 5 decades now of globalization or more, depending on how you measure it, it's really been, in my mind, the largest accounting fraud in American history. I mean, we were sold that, you get cheaper televisions and cheaper products, and that the costs were minimal. I mean, the costs, obviously you couldn't trick people into not realizing their jobs were leaving, but I don't think anyone ever really accounted. The real fraud is that none of the costs were really put on the balance sheet at all. We were just told all the benefits. And, it's one of those things that just happens really slowly. I mean, some of those effects happen pretty quickly. You go through the Midwest and you look at these formerly great cities like, of manufacturing prominence, especially along the water, Detroit, Cleveland, Youngstown, not along the water, but, Cincinnati, St. Louis. And then you look at, how quickly China's been built up, and you'd be a fool to not understand that there's a very high correlation between the decimation of our middle class and our manufacturing capability and all the knock-on effects. I mean, we talked about fentanyl earlier. Like, that is a direct cost of globalization. I mean, you go down the list, all of the social costs needed to be brought to bear when that decision was made. But sort of, if you kind of just take a regular economics utilitarian view of this, the costs are really just cost of labor is lower here, so therefore it makes sense to do. And the more I dug into that, more it really pissed me off, honestly, and made me want to understand why this decision was made and what we could do to change it. And this was in 2017, 2018. So, there have been big breakthroughs we're all aware of in AI, especially in 2017 with the transformer and some of the papers that came out after that. And a light bulb just kind of went off in my head. Aaron at that time had been stepping away from remesh and getting really into manufacturing. And I had been digging into this kind of broader idea. What if this promise of automation and AI is actually upon us for the first time? And, there'd been promises of AI for decades, but there were hints that this one was the real deal. I mean, driverless vehicles in 2008 were thought to be like 30 years out. And just by like 2014, we had made like 20, I think, like, for people who weren't around in 2008, don't realize how crazy the progress from 2008, 2014 were in driverless vehicles in 2014 to now. And so, and a lot of that is the ability to do cheap compute, both at the edge or not, but just the growth of cheap and really high quality sensors. And then obviously the breakthroughs on the compute side for the on the analytics side, where, in 2017, 2018, all of a sudden you had like real hints of real AI for the first time. And so I was just asking, man, like, but if Bitcoin, for example, was like all about decentralization in the world of bits, like, what would decentralization in the world of atoms look like, especially if you had a technology that was operating as sort of the analog to digital converter? What if AI and the new breakthroughs in technology writ large allowed you to drastically collapse cost curves in physical industries? And these are the largest TAMs in the world. And that was kind of the aha moment that got me really excited about building, a reindustrialized future for America. And that's not just in manufacturing. I mean, that sent me down a lot of rabbit holes within agriculture, manufacturing, and, whether advanced or not, aerospace, and so on.
That's awesome. So it sounds like it was a sort of a combination of obviously having the right friend in there, and then right timing in terms of emerging technologies, even market forces, and then some of your internal realizations at the hedge fund. What though ultimately made you decide to actually take the jump? Because it's one thing to realize it and then just be like, man, somebody should build this, and then go back to building relationships of being a quant. What makes you go, I'm going to quit my cushy job and take a huge risk here?
Yeah, it's I mean, you and I have talked about this earlier. There's this kind of meme going around where everyone in tech is discovering Nietzsche now, and I think it's all wrong. I think the movement that we're building is, or at least the movement we're building is much more Chesterton than Nietzsche. And back then I was obsessed with, I was just sick and tired of all the pessimism, to be honest, like the degrowth pessimism, the stuff that was on mainstream media, that I've been kind of told my whole life. And I, like, honestly, it was a really easy decision, but what's the Chesterton quote? It's like, it's fundamentally un-American to be cynical. And I think that had always stuck with me as like a rallying cry around, going and just building stuff and not listening to all of the literati or the powers that be, especially because, like, in my mind, we'd managed to, especially in the venture world, I wasn't a part of the world back then, but rally some of the best and brightest and get them to go work on fundamentally unserious problems for decades. And in my mind, like, if this was true, market around sort of where automation was going to unlock venture scalable or whatever that means, but unlock massive business opportunities in these worlds that were previously kind of not thought about from the tech world. I thought I needed to do it right now, because if I don't do it now, someone else is going to do it. So it was much more taking as a given that this was definitely going to happen, and I just needed to make sure I didn't miss the boat. And it was still very early back then. But I'd saved up some money. I was single. I mean, these are like the more serious answers too, like or specific answers. Like, I'd saved up money. It was the middle of COVID. We were fully remote, and we got into Y Combinator with the idea for Atomic, which really gave me the confidence to leave. I mean, Aaron was kicking around the manufacturing idea. I was much more looking down the sort of route of where we could apply these tech in kind of agriculture, food production. And when we got into YC, and really before that, when we landed on just the giant market that is injection mold tooling. I mean, tens of billion, maybe $100 billion industry servicing $1 trillion mass manufactured plastic goods industry. And the fact that the MPS is in the trash for these businesses, and that they've been mostly offshored, and that most of the process for tooling, the design and fabrication of the tooling, can be automated actually, and that you'd be taking away jobs, not from people in the Midwest most of the time, but from people who in the Midwest had lost their jobs to 60, 50, 40 years ago. It was just felt like a home run. And I got to tell you, there's that kind of curve of, all startups where there's the initial optimism and then the trough of something. And then you kind of, I mean, that was that initial peak. And then going through YC was that trough, and that trough was a lot deeper and longer than I had expected, I'll just say.
So what was the core concept that you guys pitched to YC for Atomic?
It's exactly what it is now. We had kicked around some other ideas that I've now seen. We looked at doing something similar to Hadrian. I mean, we knew what Hadrian's initial pitch was. And we know the folks from Plethora, I mean, and a number of Picnic's a close advisor to us. And a couple of ideas more in like marketplaces, just in time manufacturing, but for a number of reasons, we didn't want to do sort of a just-in-time manufacturing peer-to-peer. I've seen a couple of companies trying to do that now. Maybe it could work. But the idea that we ultimately chose, which we pitched, is exactly what the company is still doing to these days, which is automating the design and fabrication of tooling. And we're starting with plastic injection mold tooling.
Oh, cool. So what did that trough of despair look like for you guys? What did you run into?
Yeah, man. I mean, it's crazy. It was the middle of COVID, which probably had something to do with it. But I got out of I've been living in New York for 10 years. I got out of there. Aaron was living in Pasadena. I went and got a place 40 minutes away on the beach to do COVID. And so definitely the strangest YC batch. I mean, it was fully remote. It was the first and maybe first of two remote batches, I think. There's one after us, and I think then they went back to in-person. And to their credit, the YC folks were great, but they were scrambling too. Like, they had to figure out how to do it remote. Maybe the one before us was remote too, but it was the 2 or 3 COVID remote batches. And there weren't a lot of deep tech folks. The kind of partners we were given were great, but like, their understanding of manufacturing was like, no, it's just a thing we have to unfortunately do. The real value, like, it was a guy who his understanding of manufacturing was he made a consumer product that he went and spent a lot of time in China to go get made. And we're like, no, this is like missing the entire point. The way bigger opportunity for all of us isn't to just keep making cool doodads overseas and hope they go viral because you're good at SEO or marketing or whatever, or running the business. Like, the real big opportunity is to move all that stuff back here. That's the $1 trillion opportunity. And there's a bunch of those. And so I think we were kind of an odd duckling in the batch anyways, especially one that was filled with NFT, literally NFT companies, creator tool companies, that kind of stuff. Great folks building these businesses. I wanted them to succeed, but like stuff we were wasn't actively shorting them. Like you can't short it, but like wasn't spending a lot of time with the other companies because it's just we were working on something so different and it wasn't sexy. It was a year before the American Dynamism, or a year and a half before the American Dynamism blog. It was a year, 2 years before a couple of these $1 billion sort of, onshoring, resiliency focused funds that the big VCs are all forming. And so, we went down, talked to over 100 investors. I mean, I still have the Google sheet that we made to keep track of everything. And everyone was like, yeah, it's cool, but it's just, no one really wanted to bite. They were so stuck in this narrative gated version of the world. And this is like a really interesting thing that I learned from YC, was this idea of like narrative gating. That's what I call it. I don't know if someone has probably come up with a way better and probably written about this, but like you go down the list from like nuclear to capital's willingness now to engage with these high capex businesses, to VCs now willingness to invest in national security companies. There's so many massive opportunities that are just stuck. They're gated behind a narrative, which is really frustrating, but it's also a white pill because all you have to do is say the right words and say them enough times. So nuclear, nothing's changed. Like basically, I mean, there's been some breakthroughs recently on both the fission and fusion side, but the reality is nothing's changed in like 40 years around nuclear. But all of a sudden, every politician down the street from me, both on the left and the right, is a proponent for nuclear. And what's changed? Like literally just the narrative. Whether the Greenpeace folks have lost power or they've come around to I don't know exactly what it is, but it's just a narrative gate. I mean, same with the NatSec stuff, Palmer Luckey and Trey, and Grimm and all the guys over there should be given like, I mean, if there was like if there was a version of like Tech World's, Presidential Medal of Honor, they should be given it, because nothing's changed about the reality of the national security risks of how our global supply chains are set up. I mean, the fact that moms in the Midwest can't get baby formula because the Suez Canal is blocked, like, is insane. But it's something that the average person only notice when it hits them. And so, for us, like the narrative gating around onshoring was just everyone had the kind of the old take of, oh no, I mean, China's cheaper. And no matter how many times you show people graphs of like, look at the wage growth in China, look at the size of their middle class, like it's not cheap to make stuff over there. And those are the obvious bits. The less obvious ones are like, what are the risks of not being in charge of the precursors to our pharmaceuticals, to precursors to baby formula, to, I mean, you go down the list, and still, I mean, maybe we just weren't good enough at the propaganda. But once the supply chain crisis started to hit, all of this changed. Everyone came back to us, which is great. All the big investors, mostly inbound, were like, and it was just like a couple of months. Like, aren't you the guys who are saying we're going to make it in America? I mean, this is why I tweet kind of tongue in cheek, a couple times a week or whatever. We're going to make it in America, because it's like that's the mission, and that's what we're all working on. And I think trade is core to foreign policy. Like, where you make your stuff is a decision, and sort of the great grand strategy that people who have way longer term visions than our politicians are thinking about, and have their smartest people working on 24/7 year round. And a huge chunk of that is the sovereignty of their supply chains, whether it's the precursors, the rare earths, whatever it is. And I think we need a real return to seriousness in this country about working on those things, both in the private sector, and down the street, in here in DC.
What do you see as you mentioned earlier, the costs of offshoring? A lot of this stuff weren't really discussed. what do you see as some of the obvious costs and also some of the sort of more insidious hidden costs that come from offshoring a lot of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it. I mean, this one is it's for me one of the biggest impacts is sort of. We touched on a few, so we touched on the direct ones. There's real national security risks associated with, not being able to spin up and manufacture just like literally munitions at scale because we don't have enough. We don't have enough guys who know like literally how to operate lathes. I mean, some of this is so basic. So I think, but some of it's also a little more amorphous. I mean, it's just like culturally, like when you've destroyed so much of your middle class, because so much of the middle class was built off of our manufacturing capacity, and not just in the Rust Belt. I mean, my mom grew up in Binghamton, New York, tiny town. She grew up in Enwell, which is a tiny town next to Binghamton, which is where a guy named Thomas Tull is from, actually. And Thomas, probably more reticent than I am. He doesn't do any podcasts, although way more famous from his previous career. That guy came from absolutely nothing in a town that used to be the global headquarters for IBM. You go to Binghamton, Endicott, Enwell, New York, and it's nuts. It looks like, it looks like you're in like some of the parts of the area. I mean, not Binghamton itself, but just around it. Looks like shots from like Chernobyl. I mean, the factory's still there. IBM's factory is still there, but it's basically bombed out. And so much of the city is over a number of generations. I mean, these people can't just they don't just get up and move somewhere else. People have a lot of roots, and I think that's important. I don't like the sort of fungibility in the world of atoms a lot of people in tech assume, right? Oh, just like get up and move. Like the one thing I'd love to have more in this country, and I think part of it has died because of, this carving out of the middle class, which was an effect of the globalization, is like this kind of death of civics, like within the US, within these towns that, could sustain. They didn't need an IBM sized business to keep everyone employed in good jobs. The country, if you drive through the Midwest, like there's tons of towns that a lot of people haven't heard of that had insanely high median incomes. I mean, Canton, Ohio, for example, or Youngstown, like we hit on earlier, but Canton was like the top 10 median income in like 1930 or 1940. Every couple of weeks, someone in VC retweets this graph from Bloomberg from a couple of years ago that includes Canton, and no one's heard of Canton. I've heard of Canton. It's not that far away from where I'm from, but all the industry that was there, so much of the industry that was there, and in these second and even third cities, just got destroyed. And as a result, yes, the obvious effects like that we hinted at earlier are okay. National security, maybe it affects the GDP, whatever. But it's the social thing that I think is the biggest effect. And like I was saying, that when you're asking like what isn't on the balance sheet, it's like I don't think you can write off the fact that so much of the drug and fentanyl crisis and opioid crisis is because people don't have good upstanding jobs. There isn't that gig at the Ford Motor Plant anymore where you work for 30 years and you get the Rolex and you have a retirement and you have a pension and you know that your kids are set. You know that you're set. Your kids don't have to, you don't have to worry about your kids taking care of you. That's all gone. And whoever, I don't know if there's like one I don't think we have to have the mindset of like revenge on the people who took that, but we should be really angry that that's all gone. It was completely avoidable. And I think it's something that we can reinstill if people are willing to invest their time, resources, gold, blood, and treasure on the right problems.
Yeah, I think that cultural side is key. When you think about the effects of being in a small town and most of the men, in many cases also the women, working at the same factory. And so the kids, it's not just like there's good jobs, but there's 50 employers. There's 2 employers or maybe 1 in case. So the whole town does life together they all work generally at the same place. Their kids can go to the same school or couple schools. They mostly all go to church together on Sundays, and so there's that social kind of cohesion that comes from doing life that way is incredible, and it's gone.
It feels like it, man. I mean, and I don't want to I hinted at earlier, kind of, I had a career before all of this. From 13 to 20, I was in music. I started a band. I was like 13. I guess it was sort of the first startup I started. Printed all the merch, booked all of our shows, got us booked with it was like a punk rock emo band. So we were 14 and playing with the Misfits and the Ramones and not our favorite bands, but the bands that were a little washed up, but we're back on tour, in Cleveland, that we could get on those shows.
That's awesome.
Couldn't get on the Blink-182 show, whatever I was into back then. But it's that exposed me to a whole group of people who, a lot of the people in the music world are just brilliant artists, whatever. And that was a great run. I mean, we got signed to a record deal when I was 15. Then we got signed to the largest independent label in the country when I was 19. We did the whole tour in the country. We were on MTV. There's a lot of funny photos of me with very, swoopy hair, sticking around on the internet. But it also, these are Antifa people, but a lot of people in the music and arts worlds are I think, especially touring around, you play Altoona, Pennsylvania, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. You show up at these places and it's a lot of anarchists and angry people and tattooed head to toe. I mean, I got a lot of tattoos, but purposely disfiguring themselves, piercings and all this stuff. And it gave me a lot of, I don't know if it's grace or I don't understand where all these people are coming from, but sort of meeting all these people really early on, especially when they were literally 14. I can't speak for the 35-year-old who still won't get a job. But the fact that a lot of these people are 13, 14 and born into these post-industrial, and I don't think we're post-industrial overall, but the city literally was in its post-industrial age. Again, the Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania's, the Altoona's, the a lot of the places in the middle of nowhere in Texas. And you can't help but feel bad for a lot of the people who grow up there, because that's all that they're exposed to, is a lot of pessimism, a lot of anger. And for me, when a country no longer reveres its forebears, irreverence kind of becomes a moral duty, I think. And so nowadays, a lot of people, millions of people, depending on how you want to measure it, don't seem to really believe in the American project, the American story. And I think that's on us in a lot of ways, or not really those of us who are under 50, but the folks who had a big hand in the deindustrialization of the country, because it's not just about, wanting more steel factories or whatever. I'm not saying we need to kind of go back to the days of, child labor or the Singer textile factory fires in New York or any of that stuff. But we should have a nice middle ground between, a country that makes less and less of its own goods and is giving away more and more of its sovereignty, and what we had 100 years ago. And I think there was a sweet spot, that we don't. This isn't a pie in the sky fake place. This already existed 50 years ago. So I think, and in the fact that the smartest industrialists and technologists are still in this country, and the most willing capital markets are still here to fund innovation. It's how could you not be excited about this moment?
Yeah. So you went from building Atomic, co-founding it with Aaron, directly working in American reindustrialization through a company that you started, to then investing in a bunch of other similar companies or adjacent spaces to Tamarack. Yep. How did that transition happen from founding Atomic to then being an investor?
Yeah, it was pretty quick. So, I've been investing. I mean, I was looking at public markets. I was a quant and a trader, and my free time, I would angel invest a bit here and there. Although the sort of regulatory stuff there is so onerous that they really dissuaded you from participating outside of your job, but you were allowed to. You just, it was a lot of hoops to go through. Um, but some of those companies I invested in early, had done well. And that was my first way of really kind of betting on this area. I invested in a couple of years before we started Atomic, I invested in a company that was digitizing a ton of physical infrastructure data, um, and had all these novel sensors and novel agreements with these massive OEMs, and we're going to unify all these different disparate parts of this particular industry and provide one single place, single data layer, across, again, like all the different OEMs, and it was a company that's now done pretty well. And I I had kept investing even when I started Atomic, but when I stepped aside from Atomic, the opportunity in these spaces really seemed like it was hockey sticking in terms of inbound interest. So I'd kind of had a number of years of messing around, but as soon as I stepped aside, literally 2 weeks after I stepped aside, I met Evan Rogers, from True Anomaly, and it was literally right when I was leaving, or stepping into more of an advisory role. And at that time, I was not sure, like, do I want to start a company or start a fund? I'm always going to be investing. I had a number of kind of some of these bigger funds that we all know, like reaching out, asking what I was going to do. Do I want to go in house? I still had this, bug that I wanted to build my own stuff, and I don't know if that's if that's something that I need to get over or not, but I don't think I ever will. And so I for better or worse, despite never having worked in venture, it's like, I'm just going to figure this out myself. Turn down a lot of great cushy gigs, but I had learned my lesson earlier from Waste, where again at these shops, like, even if they love you, like, you're not going to be given a huge chunk of the equity unless you've like sold your business for a ton of. I mean, even some of these guys have sold their business for, had a huge exit, and that fund was in their Series A and B or whatever. Like, a lot of those guys' deals are a lot worse than you think, just because, again, there's the incentives just aren't there. Why would the fund give someone $500 million of carry? Sometimes they do, but I think a lot of these funds, especially as they're getting sort of multi-strategy later, as some of them are going to probably IPO in the future, like, nobody's getting out of their seats. And so I realized I got to go start my fund or join on kind of with some folks who were kind of earlier on in the process. So I went on like a few month quest to go help start True Anomaly, and I'll leave Evan to tell that whole story. But there's a lot of really good early hints at a lot of the folks who are now big on Twitter or starting companies. A lot of those folks were kind of around the rim and ultimately became early investors in True Anomaly. And so I helped them get their first investors, join the board as an advisor, turned down joining the company just because, again, I knew I wanted to build my own thing. And again, I mean, you meet Evan and the founding team there, and you realize, like, they don't need more kind of figureheads around the table. They just need people who are just gonna keep their head down and execute. And I realized I just didn't want to do that at someone else's company. And so while that was going on, I had gotten introduced to Jamie and John. I was sort of early stages of fundraising for my fund. I was targeting, looking for like a $15-20 million kind of solo GP first fund. I thought it was very doable given kind of the network I had built in hedge funds and VCs. And now that this back at that time, a lot of the stuff that we're all excited about now was just gaining momentum, but it had gained enough momentum where, even just, leaving Atomic a little over a year after doing YC, we had really built a name for ourselves. And that's only, force multiplied now, I think, in the 2 years since then. So from part of that, as I was having these combos, one of the guys was a headhunter, and executive hunter and sort of placement agent at hedge funds. And that's how I knew him. And he was going to help me, introduce me to some high net worth folks to help, become LPs for my fund. And as I was telling him the thesis for the fund, he kind of stopped me in the middle. He's like, you got to meet these guys, Jamie and John. I mean, they are ex-hedge fund guys. They live down the street from you, so to speak, in the New York area. Have a lot of connectivity with the fund I was at. It actually turned out that one of our heads of trading at Wace used to work for Jamie, which is a really small world thing. We had all these mutuals. And most importantly, they'd been investing across sort of new industrials, manufacturing, defense, supply chain, logistics, and they had some awesome wins. I mean, they were in some really awesome companies, ABL Space, Divergent 3D, now Figure. They were the first dollars into Archer basically, and helped Brett all the way through the SPAC. Being hedge fund guys, like, can actually dive in deep and do interesting things outside of write checks. And most importantly, like, the culture really hit. I mean, these guys were hardcore doers. Jamie's like an absolutely killer surfer. John was a competitive ski racer. The fund's named Tamarack after a black diamond on the East Coast at Stratton, actually. And I grew up skiing and all that. And so it was, again, similar like the Waste, like guys, who had low egos, but, know how to get stuff done and are super competitive. It's a really rare combo. And I, offered me a nice chunk of the business, like a really awesome offer, and kind of didn't need the fund to be called Austin Bishop Capital. And, to kind of chuck the ego at the door there. At the time, I was really set on starting my own fund and then ultimately spinning up companies out of it. And I kind of just remembered back, like when I was at Yale, about having this image of what I thought was going to be, and then what ultimately kind of life presented, and realized this is a really incredible opportunity to join up with these guys. So it's us three GPs, just closed our second fund about 2 weeks ago, and we'll be hiring some more junior folks. But we've just been kind of off to the races for about a year and a half now together.
That's awesome. And so, what are you guys focusing on broadly, and what opportunities are you seeing that excite you as you move into Fund 2, and even if maybe as potential founders listen to this podcast, like where are there base level critical gaps that somebody should take advantage of, I think?
Yeah, look, I mean, we invest kind of across. I mean, there's like the bumper sticker answer. I mean, we love Team and TAM, for example. I mean, the classic bumper stickers, like, what type of VC are you? And like Jeff Lewis is a good buddy, and I'd steal his sort of "I'm not a VC" line all the time. And I think it's actually useful for our fund because we aren't traditional VCs, and it's not that classic, like, I'm not like other girls thing. It really is just different. None of us worked in VC before. We were all in pretty hardcore hedge fund jobs. I mean, Jamie ran a huge book at Co2 on the public side, like a $2 billion book. John was global macro at a bunch of different funds over the years. And like, those perspectives, sort of knowledge set. I mean, actual ability to, Jamie's peerless in his ability to actually build out financial models. I mean, this guy like lived in the K's and the Q's for years. I don't know if you polled the average VC how often they read like SEC reports on public companies as comps to their privates, but I'm guessing it's like abysmally low. And also just the network and that we built both across sort of capital markets all the way through IPO. Literally can walk people in, if their company's mature enough, to the highest folks at any of the biggest banks, names you would know, all the names you would know, to, the big name, more boutique, merchant banks and alternative asset managers for when companies want to get creative on project financing. I mean, we just like, a company needs a huge chunk of real estate, like largest industrial real estate owners in the world might be one of our LPs. It's that kind of thing. We just really go to bat for our founders. And I think it's a thing that doesn't make sense if you're an enterprise SaaS. Like I understand there's a lot of hot takes on X about like, oh, VCs aren't value add, whatever. And like, I actually just agree. I agree. And I think a lot of that's from 15 years of just investing in in enterprise SaaS and consumer and just pure software companies where it's like, yeah, there isn't a lot of value add. Like how many levers do you really have to pull on like with a business like that? I mean, it's mostly, it's sales. It's like you can reduce your costs, increase your sales. Maybe there's some regulatory stuff. If you're like, an insure tech company, you need a little help there. But if you're like a deep tech business that is going to have is dual use, that has the government as a consumer, but like has to deal with like regulatory, needs to get in front of like someone high up from the, from DARPA about some new project, but also is going to expand and needs a bunch of real estate in Texas. And like we do all that stuff. I mean, it's a super relationship business. And we're close with a lot of the guys at Allen and Company. And one of the things, the Allen family's really built there, and Herb has, kept going is, this obsession's the wrong word, but like this deep commitment to, relationships, being the primary thing. I don't know if he'd worded exactly like that, but it's something that really has always stuck with me. And, outside of deciding who to write the check into, there's a lot that happens after that in the IPO. And I think these industries lend themselves way more, in hedge funds, there's this, or in public markets, there's this idea of sort of active versus passive investors. And is there any alpha in being an active portfolio management versus passive? And, I think in venture, the jury's definitely out on that for some of these industries where you don't have as many levers to pull, like I mentioned. How is a VC going to like help you with your SEO? Like you just, I guess, introduce you to a killer SEO person. Great. But where one relationship could actually be a huge, huge deal, especially in these deep tech businesses, those types of VCs, I think, are going to become more the norm over time. Those who have wide, deep networks of powerful allies across, government, real estate, alternative sources of financing. You look at a company like Epirus. I mean, they did their Series C with T. Rowe Price. Like, there's a reason they did that. Like, you know what I mean? I mean, like these companies, as they get bigger and stay private for longer, it's not going to just be the regular VCs who are trying to pivot into defense tech who are going to be backing them. It's going to be, quite frankly, the much larger pools of capital. I mean, private equity and hedge funds are way larger. Who are going to be offering, debt capital and why do like a Series D and get 40% dilution when you're a company that just needs a new factory to fulfill, 3 years of orders that you have backed up. It just doesn't make sense. Right. So we're a strange mix of skills, I think, for the regular VC world, but I think we are exactly the sort of profile of investor who's going to flourish the most in these areas in the years to come.
You hinted at that reindustrialization, manufacturing, that emphasis is here to stay, as evidenced by the enthusiasm in a higher interest rate environment. Where do you think that movement goes for the next 5-10 years? It seems like there's just been a groundswell of enthusiasm, even in the last 12 months, just picking up steam. Where do you think that ends up?
I'd love to know what you guys think. I mean, I'll give you my take. Well, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say first. If you guys, I mean, if you haven't thought about it much, but like from a third person, I worry I'm so in it. And in my own propaganda that I am at risk of, I'm always interested in hearing someone else's take.
Yeah, I think in general, kind of like with defense, I like trends that continue because they're disciplined, right? And there's always a risk to overhype something too much where it ends up hurting the underlying alpha in that movement. Let's use the VC word. And you can hype it so badly or so much that it ends up becoming sort of this meme that translates to practical, like real world, like overvaluations or funds over indexing into things like defense, or the one of the funny things you're seeing now is like feels like, at least for a while early this year and maybe at the end of last year, um, every other month there was like a new defense tech or a defense fund starting, right?
Dude, it was
And
crazy.
so defense or deep tech, especially after the Gunda boys took that bus down to the undisclosed Stanford A16Z party. And I love a lot of those guys, and I like all those guys, and personally invested in a couple of those companies. But there's a risk to hyping anything, and it could be the case for reindustrialization, in a way that ends up hurting the movement and the real opportunities that exist in that space. That's kind of how I see it at a high level.
But yeah, I mean, I think you're, and the space is right in terms of the macro,
right?
That's definitely the case. The movement towards globalism was so strong in the last 10 years. The tech company I worked for before this, it was just all about globalization, and seemingly no awareness that if you base your entire supply chain in other countries and something happens to that, you're completely hamstrung.
Right.
And people woke up to that in 2020 pretty quickly. But I think, so there's the kind of the COVID jolt awake. I think there's also another element of the U.S. has been in just a complete hegemonic position for the last 50 years or so, total military dominance, ensuring peace. And in that environment, countries can just rely on the U.S. for total military power and globalize. In a more tumultuous environment like we're seeing now, with more regional conflicts, there's question, can the U.S. actually back up Ukraine? Can they ensure peace in Palestine, Israel, etc.? Then you get not just onshoring for the U.S., but everywhere, and developing that capacity for individual countries. Are there going to be a lot more PMCs, in the next 10 years, helping those countries? I think so. Anyways, in the big picture, I think those elements are definitely there in the long run. And to your point, these are the largest TAM industries. It makes sense just from a long-term wisdom perspective to have these onshore for your country. And so I think long-term, it's definitely the right play. But I think, is there like a 1999, 2000 internet bubble that pops and then we go into a second rise? I think that's likely.
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm no fan of his, but the whole Soros theory of reflexivity is always comes to mind with these types of things. And I think right now the hype's going to beget higher prices for a while. I think they're trying to guess when it will go down. It's tricky because like private markets are not liquid, and in spite of the best efforts of like some enterprising founder every 6 months seems to start the same company and try to provide like secondary markets so you can short or whatever, but like they're never going to be liquid. They're never going to be liquid in any definition of the word. Not in a way that like the sort of the signal is above the noise in terms of what's going on internally about the company, the way that with a microsecond ticker on public stocks are. And so I think there's certainly a risk to get too hyped. I mean, look at all of our fallen brethren who are in the crypto world, NFT founders, these guys. I think one thing you have to ask yourself is, was there something structural about that where it was always built to fail anyways? I mean, like if it is just hype, right? Like there's no overhyping, underhyping that's going to change it.
Right.
And it's useful for me. I always have this just like Jordan Peterson quote that's always stuck with me. This idea, like if you're surfing the wave, like make sure you don't mistake yourself for the wave. You're just the surfer, and like you caught a hell of a wave. But I think some of it, I'm reticent to guess like how long the wave's going to last and all that, because like we're just sort of like surfing it right now. We're not in control of it. And certainly the summation of us will have an impact on it, especially these like billion-dollar funds, if they're just pouring tons of money at crazy valuations, will impact, but there's not enough coordination to change it. So I think from our perspective, so there's no like intervention, I think, to like keep it going longer or to avoid an overhype. The only intervention to keep it going longer, though, is to do what we're doing here, to do what we're doing, reindustrialize, to go to DC and push for policy changes, to start companies, to go work to go quit your job at a at a sort of marginal, useless tech company, and then take your brilliant skills and put it to something that's actually useful for the country. I think those are all great ways to try to expand it, if that makes sense. Now, if I put on my investor hat, I'm actually still pretty bullish because on how long it'll last. Like, again, I love the Gundo Bros. It feels like half our portfolio is in El Segundo, which I think Augustus explained to me is different than the Gundo. El Segundo is where the founders who are over 40 or over 30, maybe these companies are. The Gundo is everyone under 30. But or at least that's my interpretation. But we're big investors in ABL space, big investors in Diversion 3D, which is right up the street. Big investors in Impulse and Chaos Industries, all right in the hood. And then privately have backed a bunch of the both with dollars and just advice over the years, a bunch of those guys, and love all those founders. Some of them before they even started these current companies. And I think it's really important to build a culture because I'll tell you this, like the hype stuff, the other best antidote against this hype is to engender a lasting culture that can withstand hype cycles. I mean, it's almost like a tautology, but in private markets, especially in tech, like it's just driven by the willingness of great founders to start great companies and their ability to get great employees to come and work. And so no matter what happens with interest rates or whatever, like there will always be mean reversions or bear markets, loss of interest in these areas. But if there's enough people building really awesome companies, like the VCs at the end of the day are at the mercy of the great companies being founded. And most VCs kind of are spiritually very subject to FOMO, as we all know. And so, they can have all the theories in the world about how this stuff's oversold, but if another person starts a great company and it gets to $10 million in revenue in like 6 months, like, sorry, they're going to be opening up their checkbook. And I think that's the best antidote, is just to keep building.
Yeah. So maybe this is a great transition to talk about Reindustrialize and what you guys are doing there.
Yeah, look, I mean, so there's this great philosopher that I don't think, gets enough hype in the tech world. Peter Thiel talks about him a lot, but not nearly as much as he doesn't focus on sort of memetics. So there's this guy, John Gray, who has this whole theory of sort of progress. And, he sort of bifurcates progress along technological and moral. And, if you kind of were to graph, the historical progress of technology over the years, it's kind of monotonically increasing. I mean, even if you were to sum like all the societies together, there's not a lot of like massive steps back. There's not a lot of, oh man, like this is a huge roller coaster. We got transistors, but then we went back to the Bronze Age for 20 years, and then we got transistors again. Like it's kind of just up and to the right. And again, this is like across all cultures. I mean, some are way more flat because they rely on other countries to invent the stuff, and then it gets imported. But it doesn't really go down that much. And on the moral side, well, there's two problems. One, like, how do you even measure moral progress? I think this is a thing that our countrymen on the left don't like to answer that. I mean, they love to answer that it's all morality is relative or whatever. But if you actually take that position, it's actually really weak, because it's like, well, then who's in charge? And like the best answer to that is just like, well, like us, we wouldn't want to give that position to someone who doesn't have our best interests. I'm not a moral relativist, but it seems to me it's really hard to hold that position and not raise your hand and be like, so therefore I'm going to be the one who's kind of prescribing. But even if you take that and you were to graph out sort of moral progress, depending on whoever's measure of morality, like it's not up and to the right. I mean, it's a show. It's a crazy roller coaster. And, I think for me, I talked about this earlier about, even though I'm deeply entrenched in this world and have a, big hand in building this culture of reindustrialization in the tech world, I still don't think like our biggest problem, or so many of our biggest problems just aren't tech problems. And they're not on that up and to the right part of the graph. And so those are actually like sometimes way harder problems to fix. And I think VCs and tech are just figuring that out now. They don't like to admit it, but if you could if you were smart enough to fix the US government, whatever that would mean, I personally think it's a Gordian knot. But like, if you were actually smart enough and could build an algorithm that would like build an entire state space of all of the interests or whatever, and like you'd be the richest person in the world. And so the idea when I hear from like the tech world that they, DC is just a show and like we don't engage there because it's just like a waste of time. It's not true. The reason they don't engage there is because they can't figure it out. I don't want to say they're not smart enough, but they can't figure it out. And they can't figure it out in a way that is, worth their time. And that's fair. I don't think anyone can figure it out. But our best and brightest are not smart enough to figure out DC or figure out all of the, even on down to sort of the state and city level political problems that we have with technology. Because again, fundamentally, these aren't tech problems. They're cultural problems. They're sort of bureaucratic problems. And that's a whole other podcast. But, what we're trying to do at Reindustrialize is kind of almost bridge those two graphs we're describing. So I think it kind of sells itself. We've had over 100 people on a daily basis now RSVPing for Reindustrialize. And something that Aaron and I wanted to do going back like 3 years, we were running these, Clubhouse rooms back when like Clubhouse was big for 2 months. I don't know if you remember that in the middle of the pandemic. Yeah. We were doing YC, but then in the evenings we were doing Clubhouse rooms and we both gained like thousands of followers, and neither of us are like big social media guys. We didn't have a strategy. We don't know how to we don't effort post. We don't you can tell by my presence, I probably should try. I just don't really care. And we really struck a chord on the Clubhouse one, just kind of talking about a lot of what we were building. And it was almost like a proto version of this movement, these Clubhouse rooms that we were running. And, back then we just didn't have the social clout. And I don't think the movement was in a place where, Hadrian had done like a massive, $100 million raise, Gel Catalyst had announced their billion in Eclipse and got on the list of their $1 billion sort of onshoring resiliency, like whatever you want to call it, funds. And also, quite frankly, like the country was in a lot better place back then, even though it was the middle of COVID. Mm-hmm. And I think now 4 years on, all those things combined finally are waking up a lot of people, even on both sides of the aisle, to the sort of acute need so that the interest in this and the acute need to push for reindustrialization. And so it's a conference that we're throwing in Detroit, enough hinting at what it is. We're convening sort of all of the biggest stakeholders across capital markets, investing, both private equity, or all private equity venture funds, hedge funds, banks, getting all of those stakeholders from the world of dollars in the same room as all the stakeholders who matter from the world of sort of politics and government. So we have senior leaders from DARPA, DIU, DOE, current and former White House admin. We have inbound from very recent presidential candidates, current Congress people asking if there's a place in the program for them to speak. And then not most importantly, all equally important, because I really think these kind of three things all connect, the leaders from the world of builders, and that's both new and old industry. And so we've had just amazing inbound from these old industrials. We have like 250, 300 companies represented, founders of these brilliant companies. I mean, we do make stuff here. Like that's not lost on me. It's just the tech world and the VC and the capital world that wants to fund that just has been blind or unwilling to build in these spaces. But there are these $100 million, billion-dollar companies, making stuff here. There's a guy. Wait, did you tell me about the guy who manufactures all the televisions, like white label for?
No, I haven't heard of
touch on this later. So I gotta remember his name. There's a guy who has a brilliant company. He owns basically the whole thing, and he manufactures televisions, white labels them to, it's electronic stores. He's in America, and he owns 100% of his business. Or like the fellow you had a couple of weeks ago who does the transformer manufacturing business, do a couple $100 million top line. And guess what? He doesn't own 5%, 10% of his company. He's not going to own 10% of his company at IPO the way like the average tech founder will who raised from VC.
Right.
So there's a lot more, there's so much interesting dynamic founder stories going on in this country, even just in the old industrial world. And so we're bringing all those guys together into Detroit for a 2-day event. A bunch of brilliant speakers, Shyam from Palantir, a global COO of Palantir, is going to give a keynote. Rob McHenry, the number 2 guy at DARPA, is going to sit on a panel that I'm moderating with Kevin Zinger from Divergent 3D, which is nuts. That guy's company is, he is one of the most brilliant founders I've ever met, period. But especially when you adjust for like he doesn't have Twitter. It seems like if you don't have Twitter, like VCs don't know about you. But that company's raised hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, built a massive revenue machine. And he just doesn't really care about the limelight. And he's building a super advanced manufacturing company. And he also on the side, his company makes, using his technology, what I think is the sexiest and definitely the fastest supercar in the world right now. And they've turned that into just a side business where they sell them for like $3 million a pop. And, that's the kind of stuff, by the way, I think gets the VCs excited, is when they realize how fast some of these businesses can scale. I mean, we talked about sort of alpha before. No one in VC really talks about the Sharpe ratio, but like when you're looking at investment, especially in public markets, you have to look at the risk adjusted return. And I just think a lot of these industries, like it's not obvious to me the risk is going to be the same as, SaaS or ad tech or whatever. And so we're, putting everyone together in a single room. We're making them, it's a giant space. We're making everyone come to Detroit to sort of re-emphasize the sort of former glory of the country and of the Midwest particularly, and bring everyone from the coasts. I mean, there's no shortage of giant events like this that happen all the time. Maybe not exactly like this, certainly not with this level of people on one from so many different groups, but this kind of thing happens every other week in, SF or New York. And I think it's important, and it's a sign of how durable I think that this movement is, that no one's batting an eye at Detroit. And some are actually really psyched. They're like, "Oh, I've heard it's like growing a bunch. We got to come." Don't get me wrong. I'm loyal to Cleveland, not Detroit. So if there's a turnaround story, I want it to be Cleveland. I think there's room for both. But that's what we're doing. We're throwing at the end of June. Program's been basically booked, and like I said, the tickets are basically sold out. We have like a fifth of the total number of tickets being requested on a daily basis. So every 5 days it sells out, and it's been doing that for weeks. So we have the unenviable task of sort of figuring out how we solve that problem. But I think we're hitting on a chord here. I know you guys are coming. You guys have been really helpful getting a number of other folks. Can I name some of those people at all that are coming?
Yeah, it's up to you. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So we got, Eric Prince is coming,
yes,
which is going to be a really, really strong panel. I think we might have SecNav on that panel as well. So yeah, I think, reindustrialize.com, take a look. And it's not to be too much of a tease, but it's just the beginning of we've had so much inbound just from this of like, what are you doing? What's going on? this is sort of a prelude to a much longer term and larger thing that we're building. So going to be great to see how the feedback is from this. But I think in short order, there'll be a number of really exciting things going on right off the back of it.
Super exciting, dude. We're very excited to support you guys and be there. And
Totally.
As you say, GM, we're going to make it in America.
Amen, brother.
Yeah. Well, dude, thanks so much for coming to the pod. This was an awesome conversation.
Yeah, great to have you.
And we'll put the link to Reindustrialize in the show notes so people can check it out.
I appreciate that.
All right, man. Great to see you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs founders building dynamic companies, powered by American ideals and a positive national vision. These are the kinds of founders that embody the optimism and competence of the people who come on this podcast. If you're interested in investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture fund and follow the link to apply.